From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everyone. We're delighted to see such a turnout for today's session. This is another in the series of LC's Digital Future in You that's sponsored by Library Services, and that's coordinated by Angela Kinney and Judith Cannon, chiefs within the Acquisitions and Bibliographic Access Directorate. And I'm Beecher Wiggins. I'm Director for Acquisitions and Bibliographic Access. So I got that on the record. I often go through all of this and never say who I am. And we've invited colleagues from our local institutions to join us. So we're happy to see, I recognize some of you. And somebody's waving in the audience to let me know that she's here, and I've seen others. So we're delighted to have you here today. This is an update on the Library of Congress's effort to lead a transition from the MARC format to a different bibliographic framework. And we want to update you on what's happened in the long hiatus since we have given an update to LC staff. We've been talking at ALA Annual and other venues, and it's time to let you know what we're doing. Roberta Schaefer isn't able to be here this morning. She's the Associate Librarian for Library Services, but she's here in spirit. She's in Culpeper talking to the staff there, and I'm told that we actually have the Culpeper staff dialed in, and I was told I didn't have to act any differently or remember anything extra, so that's good. So what we plan to do is basically go through the sessions this morning. We have 3 who will be presenting and updating us, and we think in the interest of moving things forward and making sure that we get through the entire session that we'll have all 3 go through and then have questions at the end. You can have your questions directed to whomever of the 3 you wish to direct the answers. We'll start with Hart McCallum, who is one of our own. She's had a sterling career here at the library and nationally and internationally, leading technical standards and in particular the MARC format. So she is our resident expert, well recognized. And she's currently chief of the Network Development and MARC Standards Office, and she's been leading the technical effort for this transition that you'll hear more about shortly. Eric Miller has been working with us for the past year or so, and he is a co-founder and president of Zepheira, where he advises businesses and other organizations, including the Library of Congress, on matters of a technical and semantic web nature. Many of us know him from having heard him speak at conferences. I think I became aware of him at the 2007 or 8 ALA conference here in Washington, where he spoke to the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, trying to shake us up and stir us to move in a different direction, and it slowly took hold. Until 2007, he led the Semantic Web Initiative for the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. During his work there, his responsibilities included the architectural and technical leadership in the design and evolution of the semantic web. Prior to that, he was the senior research scientist at OCLC, and important for us in the library world, the co-founder and associate director of the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, which was an open forum that engaged in the development of interoperable online metadata standards that supported a wide range of purposes and business models. And I can say it's been special for me to have been involved in working with him on behalf of the library for the past year or so, in fact, on behalf of the library community. And Vinod Chachra, I have to ask him about pronouncing his surname. I think I've been mispronouncing it all this time that I've been working with him. So if I just say Vinod from the rest of this, you'll know that I'm trying to dance around that. But he seemed to be not bothered by that. He is internationally recognized lecturer and consultant in the field of information and systems planning. Beginning in 1975, he designed the original software that in 1980 became the Virginia Tech Library System, which we now call VTLS, and he's been active in the profession for 30-some years. He earned his PhD in industrial engineering and operations research at Virginia Tech, has been active on behalf of the library community since then. During his career, he's received many honors, and he's written 2 books, has a chapter in a 3rd book, and numerous journal articles. And having worked and interacted with him on various occasions over the past decade, I give nod to his collaborative spirit and the respectfulness that he brings to any interactions that we have. So with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Sally McCallum to update us on the library's efforts, and then she will step aside for Eric to update us on the technical happenings since then. Sally.
Thank you, Beecher, and good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to give you an update on the BibFrame development. I'm going to first start with one slide, a single slide on the background, because we still get the question of why. Why are we doing this? Why are we going to change? Why do we need to change? And to me, there are sort of 3 things to summarize. There's a new environment that's been developing since 1990, and that's about 20 years ago, or almost 25 at this point. New communications technologies, radically different, that have the internet, data linking, all sorts of capabilities that we didn't have before that. Data encoding focused on the new technologies. You had XML that came along, and then you had RDF that was developed that enabled data to take advantage of linking. And you have new views of data. As you know, that in the mid-90s we had FRBR, or FRBR, in the library community. DAX is the model they use in the archival community, CCO in museums, and there have been others. There has been a real interest in sort of modeling their data in the last 20 years. So we embarked on this new project in order to have an alternative to MARC that would make us more compatible with these developments, and we call that BibFrame. So over the last year, we've accomplished several things with respect to BibFrame. First of all, we developed a high-level model that takes advantage of the new environment. I'm not going to show you that model, but it will be shown in the course of some of the other presentations. The high-level model is simple in concept. It's difficult in detail, but as all models are. We wrangled with the controversial parts, features of it. Authorities, it is different from the way we think of authorities in today's environment, and we wanted to have people have options on where their authority information is coming from. We have a concept of annotations, which is a core piece of the model, and it enables people to append information, and so there's been a lot of controversy on what is appended information and what is the status of appended information. But we've wrangled with those. We've received help and support from a small consultative group, which held its final meeting yesterday. We called this group the Early Experimenters, and they included the National Library of Medicine, representatives from the National Library of Medicine, from OCLC, from the Deutsche Bibliothek, from the British Library, from George Washington University, and from Princeton. Let me say that their support has been invaluable to us over this last year. as we sort of tried to initiate and get this effort going. And we developed tools and experimented with existing data. We did trial vocabularies, we did trial transformations, we did trial RDF. Some of the people in my office know that when I say trial, that means that we did it repetitively and revised and reconditioned and did it again after we did a vocabulary change. So it has been a year of for us, what we felt like a little bit of turmoil, but on the other hand, we were learning a lot during that turmoil. We also carried this out in a very open environment with the open listserv with a number of presentations. We have several here at the library, and we've had them at ALA, every ALA. And releasing tools as soon as they were minted. This has kept the process open, but it's also exposed any of our missteps. It's exposed maybe some of the confusions we might have had, but we think that was the right thing to do, even though it wasn't, it didn't make for a very perfect project. So let's look at the next year. This was the last year. That was the last year. We realized that we needed more implementation experience because as we could adjust the vocabularies and adjust them theoretically, but we needed actual implementation experience to be able to see what was working, what doesn't work, and what was efficient, what wasn't efficient. And there were several places that we realized had started to experiment already, to implement already. Experimental implementations or test implementations. At ALA this summer, Colorado College had done some work, and Jeremy Nelson described it during the session there. In a little while, Vinod Chachra is going to tell you what he has been doing over the last year. He also presented at ALA. And yesterday, we had a very interesting presentation from Reinhold Hüvelmann from the Deutsche Bibliothek, who was telling us what they have been doing for the last 6 months or year that feeds into experimentation with this project. So we need to tap that implementation experience, but in order to do so, we need to have a stable RDF vocabulary that the implementers are using. That's something we have not had this year. And we needed some implementation tools. With respect to the stable vocabulary, we needed that to be able to compare so people could talk to one another and see how an implementer could say something works for me, and an implementer can say, I'm going to try so-and-so, and they're talking sort of the same language because they're using the same experimental vocabulary. With respect to software, we contracted in September or August with Zepheira to do a profiling and input module, and that is what we will make open source, so that anyone who wants to participate in implementation testing can do so and have a jump start on it by using this module and adjusting it the way they would like to see it. We will have a glimpse of that a little bit later when Eric Miller gives his presentation. It's not going to be completed until, I say glimpse because they're only partway through the development. It's not going to be completed, and we will really open it up and make it available to anyone, open source, in January. We also want to establish, we're not going to establish these sort of a small group or a chosen group or something like that. We want a self-selected group. We want a group of people who are implementing, so that in fact the conversation is not theoretical or not just what I happen to think of this morning, but it is in fact something that is happening with the software that I'm working with, and I'm seeing some things happen, or I'm seeing inefficiencies, or I'm seeing things that need to be changed. So we want to establish a what we call a group through a listserv and have other sharing mechanisms for them, and they will self-join. They will need to say what activity they're doing, they're participating in, and how they're implementing, and then they will be able to join into the group. We hope that'll be large. At first it won't be, but we hope it will be large. A few of the early experimenters have already started doing some of that, and they will be some of the first ones that will be in that group. Then next year, we want to have the test implementations going, the dialogue going and discussion going among them, but we also want to tackle some special issues through some expert meetings. Not a necessarily series of meetings, but sort of one-off meetings where we get some experts together and talk about, well, for instance, aggregates or holdings, or there are a number of topics that we already know about or that will surface. We want to analyze some special forms of material for how they fit with the BibFrame model. We've already got something started on that with the moving image and recorded sound. Some work we're going to be doing with Culpeper, our Culpeper colleagues. And we want to analyze models with the related communities like the archivists and the museums. Because BibFrame is not RDA, and it's not just libraries, and it's not just cataloging. BibFrame is the model is to be ubiquitous. It's something that we can use in a number of environments. We will also be augmenting the basic vocabulary, but I can't emphasize this enough. We will want to keep the core of the vocabulary stable so that we can maintain the discussion. So we will augment, but we will keep stability within the basic vocabulary, and it's fairly extensive. That will enable us also with a vocabulary that everyone is using to test various kinds of interchange ideas that we might have to see how interchange can work. Because if everyone's using a different vocabulary, interchange gets a lot more difficult. And then we will, after a year of that kind of experimentation, testing implementations, we will go back in and revise the vocabulary. I put these numbers on here. These were just off the top of my head, 2.0, okay, a new vocabulary. Because anything can be on the table for change at that point. Because then we want to have something that, in fact, we can encourage our systems people to invest in and to really start to implement, to have wide implementation. We know that our system vendors are very busy generally fulfilling the requirements of their current customer base, and if they don't do that, they won't keep their current customer base. And they don't have necessarily extra money for R&D. But at that point, we want them to begin to think about how they might change their system because they have something really stable, something real to base a new system on. So that's what our plans are for the next couple of years, really, and we hope that we can keep to it. We've had a slight change in the order of the program, and actually Vinod is going to give his presentation next, followed by Eric. Okay.
Good morning. I'd like to start this morning by thanking Beecher Wiggins and Angela Kinney for inviting me here. And Mr. Wiggins, I want to tell you, don't worry about how you say my name.
Say it with respect.
And I'll tell you why. When I was dating this young lady who's now my wife for 40 years, for the first 7 months we dated, she couldn't say my name. And now it's her name. But before I get into the presentation, I'd like to take a moment because today marks the 50th anniversary of a historic event and a tragic death of an outstanding son of this great nation. I'm not going to ask you for a moment of silence, but I will ask you to join me in a round of applause for what he's done for this country. Thank you. Now for the business at hand. In this presentation, I'm going to tell you something very briefly about VTLS. Many of you don't know about it. It'll be 3 slides, no more. Then we'll get to the basic architecture of BibFrame. We'll talk about a metadata management system and how it's required to make a transition from the current MARC-based system to BibFrame is selection of BibFrame implementation strategies. It should say a selection from BibFrame implementation strategies, some examples and demonstrations, and then my opinion of what the future OPAC will look like as we move forward. In the middle, I think I'm going to do a quick demonstration, because I'll do a final demonstration at the end, but in the middle I'll do a quick final demonstration so you get an idea of what we're moving towards. That wasn't planned, but I decided to do that. So just a comment, I read a book review once that said, this book is full of new and interesting things. Unfortunately, what is interesting is not new, and what is new is not interesting. Hopefully in this presentation, you'll find something that is new and interesting at the same time. With that, VTLS, we were started many, many years ago as a first spin-off corporation from Virginia Tech. We have 2,100 libraries in 43 countries. More than 70% of our revenues come from exports, and we're made in America product, so we're really creating jobs here. We have offices in various countries, shown by the flags below. I won't go into that. You can go to our website and read that. And I do want to talk about the history of our projects. We started developing library systems back in 1974, when most of you weren't even born. Some of you weren't even born. Okay, I'm glad you're listening. You were born in 1974. See, I said that because I want to give a definition of technology. Technology is what is invented after you're born. Because anything before you're born is a part of the environment. Okay? So if you look at this map, you'll see that in 1980, we became the first system to support the MARC format. And today you'll see that we're becoming the first system to support BibFrame and to support FRBR, which we did 10 years ago. And along the years, we've done various things, but the key thing is we're doing something called Open Skies. And Open Skies fits wonderfully into the semantic web and allows you to do things, but that's not the object of this presentation. The object of this presentation is to talk about BibFrame, and all our products will get implemented into Open Skies, which includes BibFrame. Now on to BibFrame. What is the basic architecture of BibFrame? It's a very simple model, but allows you to handle very complex things. And the model is coming out of, this particular model is coming out of a Library of Congress document. I've just taken it there. The URL is at the bottom of the screen. It simply says a work can have authorities, and authorities may be subjects and authors and so forth. And then there's an instance of a work, which is different from the FRBR model that had expressions and manifestations. This just has an instance. The instance itself can have its own authorities, which is slightly different from FRBR. Then, of course, the instance and the work can have annotations. And this is where I think the model starts to become powerful. And the annotations, again, can have its own authorities. And that's the model. It looks very simple, but it really allows you to do very complex things. And in my opinion, the best thing it allows you to do is it allows you to navigate the semantic web. And I'll show you how. But first, let me tell you what Albert Einstein had to say. If you can't explain things simply, then you don't understand it well enough. So I'll try to explain this very, very simply, because we've been working for it for a long time. And I might take a moment here to go into the demonstration, and I hope I can come back to this slide. So let's see, there should be a website here. Take a second to connect, I hope. Maybe 2 seconds.
A few seconds.
Maybe forever. I just hear people saying, I never do live. And I didn't intend to do live, but I have a backup plan. I have slides of all of these. Let's try it again. There you go. Okay, so this is a regular catalog. This is our catalog. It has all this stuff in it. But I'm going to just search. What's the term I want to use? I've drawn a blank for my example here. The person who wrote Hobbit wrote, sorry? Tolkien. And Tolkien's book, famous one. Lord of the Rings. See, we have a reading audience here. Lord of the Rings. I'm going to try that. So here's Lord of the Rings, and I've added to the title BF work. So it's a BibFrame work here. Okay, I'm going to click on this BibFrame work, and you'll see a display, a live display of a hierarchic structure that shows the works and annotations and instances of it. So under this work, there's an annotation there, another annotation. Then there's an instance of it. If I go to one of the instances, you'll see that it has its own book cover and description and so forth. If I go to another instance, it has its own setup. This one doesn't have a book cover. And a third one, just to show you what it looks like. So you can navigate through this whole process. Of course, on the work, we can have an annotation. So I'll go to that annotation, and you can see what the annotation has in the particular thing. But the interesting thing that we have is this thing called a visual browser. So let me go to Lord of the Rings here and show you this visual browser. And this visual browser takes the information in your catalog, looks at all the links that you have, and translates the description of the catalog to a visual view. And it has Lord of the Rings here. The red arrows here are instances that you saw. Tolkien is the author here. Then these are subject categories, and these are other annotations that are there. All of the things are available to us now. So if I want to, for example, look at this, it then automatically, without the need of going back to the catalog, redraws, recenters, and you can see now the thing that's coming from the semantic web. We're moving from one node to another node through things that are connected. So I'm at this node. I've got fantasy fiction, and The Hobbit is another one of the works that we saw earlier connected to the same author. So now we see the connections with Hobbit. So you can navigate the entire web if it's all properly connected. Now, of course, the connections that are defined in BibFrame are connections that exist in your own catalog. We are trying to define connections that go beyond your own catalog because it's there. And that way you'll be able to navigate the whole world starting from any single point. I told my developers before I went to Switzerland this week, said when I come back, I'd like to have a link back from this Hobbit back to the catalog. So you can interchange that automatically. And they said, yes, it'll be done by the end of the week. I didn't realize that their definition of the end of the week was Friday at midnight. So on Monday, you'll be able to see where you click on this particular thing, you actually go back to the catalog. That for now, we'll show you a lot more of that later, time permitting. And I'll go back to the PowerPoint we had here and see if we can continue. Okay, so what is required to implement a system that supports BibFrame? First, it has to support linked records. And of course, many of us have been doing linked record in one way or another, and Ferber is all linked records in a way. You have to understand the BibFrame data model, see where the connections go. That's obvious. What we need, I think it'll take a while for people to translate all their MARC records into BibFrame records. So in order to make it a practical implementation, what we have to do is have a system that supports both the MARC records and the BibFrame records in the same database at the same time. I didn't show you that, but I started with a regular database that had other records and moved to some BibFrame records. It has to have the ability to display hierarchic records, and you saw that already. Navigation and visualization system. Because we are moving into such a complex world, which is far more complex than your local library, we have to have very simple tools, like Albert Einstein said, and be able to be used by the users with zero, and I mean absolute big, solid zero training. And that's the kind of system we're trying to build so that it becomes everybody's tool, not just the tools of specialized librarians. And finally, the example which I already showed you ahead of time. In order to do this, the first thing we had to do was create a metadata management system that allowed you to handle both BibFrame records and records from the MARC format. It has to have ingest, duplicate control, conversion of metadata records, editing functions, storage, and so forth. And all this has been done already. I'm just using examples of input formats, a standardized conversion program, and a production system internal format. And then once you have that, you can export the data in any of the formats you want. And this is what the metadata management system that we built does. It also has to have editors. Then how do you keep things synchronized? So we found with our experimentation that you really need two editors, an editor that edits the production system and an editor that edits outside records that come into your system and maintains those. And here's a more generic diagram of what happens internally in the system. And since it all works, you don't have to worry about it. It's just done. So as long as we were doing it, we were worrying about a lot of things. But now that it's done, it's pretty simple, and you can just use it. Next, the selection of BibFrame implementation strategy. We had options because we had choices to make. We had 4 different implementation options. The first was to use Ferber. We did Ferber about 8 or 9 years ago, and we knew how Ferber worked. The second was to take ISAD, which is the archival description standard. And the National Library of Wales, who's our customer, has been using this for a while, and it's based in a way in a hierarchic things, but it has a lot more flexibility than Ferber does. And we decided to use, for BibFrame, the ISAD model, not the Ferber model. Now, in the industry, there's a lot of discussion about Ferber, modification of Ferber. Do we need to keep with Ferber and not move to BibFrame and all of that? But based on what I've seen and the implementation that we have, I really think that the BibFrame model is remarkably better than the Ferber model ever was. And that if we do it correctly, it'll be able to model things that are very difficult to model with Ferber. So in order to use that flexibility, we designed it under the ISAD model. Ferber is too rigid. It only has 4 levels. ISAD, on the other hand, has a very flexible hierarchy to a point where you can skip levels if you want. You say, I need to come back here and put something in, but I don't know what it is, so I'll just skip it. And so that kind of flexibility allows for very practical implementation of data that's moving. So we talked about skipping levels and the flexibility. That's very important to do that. Now the examples and demonstration, I'll go through very quickly through some screen captures, and then I'd like to go back and show you some stuff there. This is an example where we have BibFrame work, instance, annotation attached to a work, and annotation attached to an instance. And there are screenshots of the staff client. But again, we are trying to focus our attention to the public more than the staff. So here's the public client, and you saw the Lord of the Rings. And thank you for helping me with my blind spot there. And when you get to the Lord of the Rings there, you'll see that we have the BibFrame work, the instances, the annotations, the authorities that go with it, all displayed there. And you saw some of the navigation. This is a little thing there. This is not a part of the standard. This is a part to help people think about this, and at some point in time, we'll throw that away in this particular structure, and the hierarchy is there. And you saw where the instances were there with all the book covers and all integrated right into the catalog with other things. Now here's the first difference that's coming. We're taking an annotation that is attached to the work, and this annotation is something that's provided by the publisher. Now we can integrate that right into your MARC catalog that you couldn't do previously. You could do it with a URL, but it's not integrated into the catalog like this is. Because we can now attach other things to this, like what else has this publisher published that deals with this topic. So you can get those links going on. So that's one of the annotations that's there. You saw this diagram that we did, the linked data visualization. And how does that work? It essentially shows you this diagram, and then when you click on this, it goes to the center there. And again, you've seen that. But the point I want to make is that we have to figure out first, at the highest level, what we want to do. We don't want to just navigate our catalog. What we want to do is navigate the semantic web. And if you're going to navigate the semantic web, there are certain assumptions you have to make. You cannot constrain it to things that hold you back in your own catalog. You have to open it up so you can, in fact, migrate into other parts of the semantic web. And this model and this visualization is designed to do that. And I'll show you how that works as we move on. There is a site we did called Kansas City Public Library. It is on the Civil War site. It's on the web, it's open there, it went on production on August 22nd, and there's an example of that particular site. I might be able to show you that. And here we've got icons, much better looking icons than our experimental site, where there are people there, there are events out here, there are locations over there, and there are groups, you haven't seen a group yet, that are part of the site. And they have in their website a definition of a relationship browser. That's a new term in the industry, where you're not browsing the catalog, you're browsing relationships. And I'll show you the impact of that in a minute. So when you are at any point, you can click on it, and that becomes the central point of focus. You're going from one node in the semantic web to another node in the semantic web, and you see what that's linked to. And here's, of course, a group of people that you hadn't seen earlier, these ones in green. And you can go and do that. But that's not enough. That's not enough, because what we are doing with the BibFrame model is we are describing metadata. And users could care less about metadata. We care about it because we build systems around it. But what the users are interested in is the content. When you see the Kansas City model, you'll see how linked data is used to manage content. There are timelines, graphs, maps, everything interconnected dynamically with no pre-stored information. I urge you to go there and look at it. But the point I want to make is there's a concept called reification. Reification goes beyond the triple store that you see in RDF formats. It takes a relationship from here to here and then says, how do I know that this relationship is correct? And you justify the relationship by some other artifact. So not only do we have a triple store here, we have something connected to the triple store. There's another connection that's a triple store by itself. And this is something that's come up in our experimentation. And then when Kansas City was building their site, we suggested to them they might want to do this architecture. And I want to show you this if I can live. If not, we'll do it later. So the relationship, to give an example, I might say Vishesh is my son. So the relationship between us is father and son. And how do we justify the relationship? By looking at the birth certificate. So essentially now you can have source documents attached to a relationship that you can navigate and see where that's going to take you as we move forward. So here's another example of that. Charles Dow was killed by Franklin Coleman. How do we know? There's a statement by Wilson Shannon. And if you click on this link, you'll be able to read the statement yourself. That's the general idea of linked data that we are talking about. Here's another one that says the Free Party had a supporter called Charles Dow, and we know that from a document from Henry Lane. Okay, that's the reification. I'll skip that and talk about the future of OPACs, and if there's 3 minutes after that, I'll show you the reification directly. I don't want to take Eric's time. Oh, we got plenty of time. I'm rushing through this. I'll take a deep breath. Okay, what What does the future OPAC look like? This is my personal point of view, not necessarily my company's point of view, because I still haven't convinced all the genius programmers we have that this is the right way to go, but they're coming around. So here's the semantic web. So visually, let me explain how your future OPAC will look like. I don't know if you can see OPAC there. There's the O, there's the P, there's the A, and there's the C. Okay, how simple can an explanation be? What we are saying is that the content of data that you have are going to be nodes in the semantic web where parts of it or all of it can be used by others. And some of our customers are already doing that. We're building these nodes, and they're building services on top of the nodes within the web without necessarily our involvement. Some are doing it with our involvement, others are doing it on their own. And that's what I think will change the way we think about information access in the library world. And it's very important because this or something like this, not necessarily this, but something like this, will distinguish the libraries from the Googles of the world. And we have to be able to do that somehow. We bring a lot of value through these interconnections that don't come out in a flat search like you get from Google or from existing catalog. And this is what BibFrame has to take us to if we're ultimately going to derive a benefit from this linked data stuff that we've been working on. So the future OPAC, in a sentence, it'll be part of the open data cloud. It'll be based on some kind of linked data, maybe Ferber, maybe BibFrame, maybe some other format as we move forward. It'll have no keyboards. Hopefully it'll be voice activated like many things are. So you'll be able to stand in front of your friend and say something, the friend being the computer, and then get a response back. It'll have no mouse, but we can't live without mice right now. It'll be mobile. About 4 years from now, everything will be mobile. And so if you're not going in that direction, you should be. It'll be visual. So you can, in fact, even if you don't use a mouse, you'll be able to touch things, is what I meant. It's not that you won't point at things, but you point at it with your fingers. You know how they define people in the various ages? If you type with your 2 index fingers, you belong to the typewriter age. If you type with all 10 fingers, you belong to the computer age. If you type with your thumbs, you're in the cyber age. So the idea is that you'll not know where your OPAC ends and where the rest of the data begins. And that total integration of the semantic web is where I think our OPACs and everything should head. Albert Einstein said, everything must be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. Now, if you understand that statement, explain it to me, please. And you can see that Albert Einstein is laughing all the way back to his office after saying that, saying, you figure it out. But I do have something else to say that's equally as important. And this is the VTLS framework, BibFrame development process. And also, I believe, the process that Sally has followed in the development of BibFrame itself. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We at VTLS are at the stage where the alone stage of working and developing this is coming to an end. In fact, we're going to close the alone stage in December. Then starting January, we want to be in the together stage. We want to go with people that are willing to share their ideas and their vision into what we're doing to build this thing together. So that's where we're coming. And I have to tell you, we've been watching the BibFrame development, and what Sally and her group have been doing is exactly that. They started off with an initiative that was their own, and now they're widening it to all the people, getting all the input, and trying to make this go together type of project, because we all benefit immensely if we do it together. With that, it closes my presentation, and with your permission, I'll take 3 more minutes and show you this other example. And let's see if it's still there. BibFrame development. So this is the Civil War project I was telling you about at Kansas City Public Library. I'm going to search the term Abraham Lincoln, do a search there. this thing has maps and timelines and essays and pictures and so forth. When you do that, it dynamically creates this display. And I'm going to go to the historical documents from there. So far, nothing new or different. And then you come down here, and it says there are documents like Hamilton, Gamble, Abraham Lincoln. Let me go there. I apologize for this coming up so slowly. Sometimes you just have to do it twice. So let me go back and try. Timeline events, historical documents. Let's try it again. And from Hamilton Gamble to Abraham Lincoln. There. So now what we're getting here are documents. I know what it is. This is a different resolution screen. So it's reformatting the documents for the screen size is designed for a more higher resolution screen. Okay, so here we have a document. It has its transcripts and so forth. The metadata as it exists. Notice there is metadata. And then down here, it says the visualization tool. And here's a visualization tool that is different from the one I showed you earlier. In the earlier case, we had the whole catalog that is dynamically connected by the algorithms we wrote. Here, it takes us not from metadata to metadata, but from content to content. That's a big difference. So here you see that we have Samuel Curtis, and he's been in all of these battles and so forth. He's fought against Sterling Price. And let me click on that. And here's the reification I was telling you about. It says, we know he fought against Sterling Price through these two documents. Speech on Price's raid. I can click on that. It takes me to the original content of the document. And here's that speech on Price's raid. And please, it won't let me go down. Okay, so, oops, I'm finishing. I don't want to make Eric nervous here. All right, so here we have a screen, and you can see the transcript of the document, and the transcript of the document can be opened as a PDF file, and you can read the PDF file and so forth. So the point I'm trying to say is that now users have access to original documents for any assertion anybody makes. If we had a system like this, when Mr. Obama was elected president, we wouldn't be looking around for a birth certificate. We'll be there. On that happy note, I'll end.
I'm going to do a little computer navigation, but while I do, I have to say that reification has been one of these technologies that's been part of RDF since the original specification. But that has to be one of the best examples of reification I've ever seen. When anyone can say anything about anything, who you trust becomes an important part of that. But conveying that trust, conveying that context from a modeling standpoint is very powerful, but from a visual standpoint, that's one of the best I've ever seen. Good morning. I said that already, didn't I? I'm actually, my name is Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. It's actually a pleasure to be here for several reasons. One, as Sally mentioned, basically bringing together that core group of folks and thanking them for such a wonderful sprint in terms of putting in place a tremendous amount of infrastructure in a very short amount of time. The other is actually to talk about something, in fact, that I haven't shared with anyone yet. So that's actually quite exciting. This is a preview of what we're going to be presenting at ALA. Usually when I come here and talk, it's always about things that have happened in the past, with an idea of where we're going to happen and go in the future. But this is a bit of a preview on some of the work that we've been doing in the context of basically from from all of the work that the early experimenters have done and the infrastructure that we put in place, and really a lot of the vocabulary and tooling that we've been able to build on by grafting this into the very fabric of the web and the open standards that underpin it. So I'm going to basically do this in sort of 3 acts. From a play standpoint, this is going to be pretty boring, but Act 1 is about talking a little bit about the building blocks and this new thing called profiles. As Vinod mentioned, one of the things that happened early on when we were asked to basically think about a model for this community is we actually spent a tremendous amount of time in landscape in terms of looking at very enormous linked data patterns that we were seeing from a lot of different communities. Literally we were drawing on almost the size of the walls in this room, all of these various communities, from all these patterns that we found in industry, in the museum community, in the library community, in the publishing community, and basically trying to reduce this as a reductionist effect to a very simple pattern that underpinned a lot of this. And this, in essence, became that simple pattern. It is a very simple model, but as Vinod mentioned, can actually be used to express a tremendous amount of things. And as Sally mentioned, it's simple, but there's a lot of complex nuances. I like to think of this as a bit of marketecture. Is that too soon? Sorry. It's really designed to provide a high-level bit of information, and convey some high-level characteristics. But the devil's in the details. There's a lot of infrastructure that basically still needs to take place, and that's what I'm about to talk a little bit about. BibFrame builds off of RDF as a very primitive data standard. It is a very simple model that basically defines how data from different parts of the web can snap together. Like Legos are very simple building blocks, but the engineering tolerances of those Legos are in part are equivalent to that of an internal combustion engine. That's what makes that satisfying click when you snap these together. So very simple primitives, but designed to basically be used by different communities to start to assemble different kinds of information together. One of the things that we've done with BibFrame is instantiate, take that principle, take those ideas, but instantiate the slightly larger building blocks that we particularly care about in our industry, in our community. The concept of people, of place, of subject, of book. So rather than the very small building blocks which RDF provides, building off of that pattern around general constructs that we can start to reassemble and reorganize to support different kinds of other kinds of discovery experiences, as was shown earlier. Legos that get into my house are purchased in different packages for different price points at different times of the year, but invariably provide a very common substrate throughout my entire house on the floor. And when they get picked up and reassembled and put into buckets, which my kids used to call good and evil buckets, but I don't quite understand that. But when they take them out of these buckets, they reassemble them into new and interesting parts. Generally, these new figures, these new shapes, have nothing to do with the shapes that they originally came from. The purpose of the Knights of the Round Table instantly get merged with the Jacques Cousteau sets. But these shapes that are built off of these different primitives are equivalent to how different communities will use BibFrame. So BibFrame lays out a lot of different constructs, a lot of vocabularies. It's dealing with a very important creative tension between vocabularies for representing our past and the very important knowledge that we've captured in our collective databases and the opportunities for moving forward. But depending on what your community perspective is or what your individual perspective is, you don't need all of it. You're interested in just some of it. So we can basically provide a way in which different communities can choose the bits and pieces that basically make sense to them and assemble the shapes that make sense to them. So Sally was talking about RDA or DAX or CC0, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying which of these shapes are any one of those communities. Angry bird. But it's really a way that provides the means for different communities to say what shape makes sense among them, but do it in a way that allows that data to be broken down and recombined with other shapes. And through that shaping, new connections are made. I don't know what makes sense when my child basically takes the Knights of the Round Table horse and sticks Jacques Cousteau on it, but to him it's a seahorse. And that works for him. So what we're looking at in BibFrame is a set of underlying principles and architectures, a set of vocabularies, and now a way of layering on top of those vocabularies how we might choose to define a subset of those for a particular purpose, a blueprint, if you will, that allows us to define and instantiate for a particular type of community, for a particular kind of asset, for a particular need, the vocabulary and tools and relationships from BibFrame that make sense to me. So we can take existing object inheritance models, WEME is an example of that, and if we want, project that into more of a web graph projection. We can choose to assemble this particular kind of structure and map it into a particular profile. But we can also take other communities' XML serializations or ways in which they structure different kinds of information and project that into a profile as well. So in this particular case, before I was just illustrating RDA, this is VRA. But underneath, start to write out the underlying code that really allows us to sort of say, I'm going to have this particular property. From a cataloging standpoint, it's going to be mandatory. It's got to be in there. It's a repeatable property. And I'm going to constrain the permissible results to be X, Y, and Z. So BibFrame gives us a lot of the raw vocabulary to start to build from. This allows us to sort of assemble it in a way that we can start to do interesting things with it. I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in examples in Act 2. So one of the things that I was trying to do, it's always helpful to sort of ground this in real-world examples. Part of what we've been doing in BibFrame is looking at, I think as everyone knows, sort of the existing MARC records that are available to us and the RDA records that are emerging now. So the one on the right, this Placing Politics, is an RDA record. It's a MARC record encoded in RDA, English translation of the one on the left. Okay, so this is basically a situation where 1970 something, a French version of this document was published, and in 2012, the record was created in 2013, this new English translation was basically available for it. And, here's the original MARC record, here's the new RDA record. They look alike, don't they? But inside of them, if we read this, if we look at this, it's very clear in the notes that this is a translation of this previous thing. In fact, they actually have included a unified title in this to try and sort of say there's other stuff here. The issue, of course, is the old record hadn't been changed. So if I stumble onto the old record, I don't really know anything about the new one. And if I have the new one, the way I'm defining those relationships is at a certain level through prose and notes, or certain kinds of structural field with text. And what we are trying to do at a certain level in BibFrame is to say, look, we're making those relationships. Now we're just going to make that relationship actionable. We're going to use the very fabric of the web to sort of connect these things together and all the benefits that entails. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means here in a second. So we can take the original record and put it through the MARC to BibFrame translation, and we basically get, the stuff on the left there. It's a book, it's an instance, it's been published at a certain place, it has certain subjects. We can take the one on the right. Again, very similar, only this particular case we're also defining a relationship not in prose, but to a formal entity in terms of an authority who translated it. And just formalizing and making more actionable the relationships between these different concepts that are generally in prose or in prose associated with certain subfields within MARC via RDA cataloging rules. We're saying these relationships in prose. This is just a way in which we can basically formalize this in a systematic way. And by doing this, what we're trying to do is draw these additional relationships. So one is a translation of the other. And I want to sort of highlight this reciprocal relationship here in a second because, you know, in theory, the original record could be updated to say it now has a translation, this new record. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. This is a preview of a tool that I'm about to show that basically makes all that possible, but I'm not going to show it yet. This is another example. This is actually quite an interesting one. George Barclay, fighter pilot, 22-year-old British Air Force pilot, basically shot down World War II. Turns out that he was copious in writing basically a journal, notes, very detailed notes about his experiences as a pilot, the sorties he ran, the different kinds of experiences that he, you know, felt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Originally came out, the one on the right, a new version of this. Name has been changed, additional reviews and forwards. Old MARC record on the left, new RDA record on the right. MARC record on the left, similar record on the right. Similar approach. We can take the existing one, we can start to basically tease out and deconstruct the MARC into these particular BibFrame assets. Take the one on the right, do the same here, and start to, in essence, record in a very formal relationship, again, what's stored in different kinds of notes. Oh, this is a previous edition of this other one. Again, unified titles being used in the new RDA record, but the old record isn't updated. It turns out the original book of this is far more popular than the new one. So if you find yourself in the old one, you actually have no notion yet of where the new one is. Again, this reciprocal link I want to come back to in a second. All right, so now I'm going to show something that we're going to show at ALA. All right, so building generalized editing tools for supporting the semantic web is a really tricky thing. We tried to do this, you know, several years at the Web Consortium of MIT. We got pretty far on it, but it was still a tricky thing. Well, what we've done in BibFrame, however, is actually constrain the problem. Now we're not talking about the entire semantic web authoring tools. We're talking about just the authoring tools that follow a particular pattern that we in this community basically care about. And by doing this, in fact, we've constrained the problem enough to do actually some pretty interesting things. So what you're seeing, in fact, here is the initial take of and by all means, please, you know, blink tag disclaimers, an initial take of an RDA profile in BibFrame for describing, in this particular case, a book. But I can basically assemble the particular properties I need, and I can assemble the particular relationships that might exist, and I can start filling this out. This is an example. And I can do this, but I can also start basically connecting it to subjects, et cetera, and let's just say is variant of picture book for children. All right, the point here is what I'm doing in this particular example is I'm building off of this profile, but I'm starting to connect, in essence, to these other entities in a very powerful way. So the Lego blocks that I was talking about, this is a tool that quickly sort of finds them and helps you as a cataloger snap these together. This particular example basically allows us quickly, in this particular case, to match the particular types that are internal to this very flexible back-end data structure, but the target for ALA is to be able to connect to third-party external resources as well. So my ability to say the author search id.loc.gov or VIAF and snap those together as easy as I'm basically doing a type ahead in Google. So this notion of being able to start to surface these different amazing content that we in the library, museum, archive community has created in an interoperable way that allows catalogers, or I'm going to say myself because I'm going to show how I use this at home, to reassemble those Legos and start to connect things in useful ways. We can save this back to the store, and this is for Jackie over here that wants to see the data. You're generating BibFrame data natively. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means here in a second. All right, so let me go back here to the presentation. So I talked a little bit about George Barclay. I talked a little bit about the books, the new edition and the old edition, a little bit about him. Some of the work that we're doing at Zepheira also centers around other projects related to genealogy, personal archiving, and large-scale data cataloging asset management. No reason normally that would basically be of use here, but it turns out that we found BibFrame to be extremely helpful in all of these particular communities. And actually by doing this, we've actually been able to discover different kinds of assets. This is in fact George Barclay, pictures of him, the original writings that he basically did, the post-telegram notice of his death, sort of additional things like that, just in this very short amount of time. Now, I found myself throughout this exercise of getting this presentation, wishing we were further along with BibFrame. Because one of the most amazing aspects that BibFrame can basically provide is allowing me, the user, the ability to add knowledge back to the catalog, to add value back to the very fabric of my community knowledge base that is my library. And I can't do that formally other than right now in this presentation. But in the very short amount of time, will be able to start snapping together these different assets with the resources that we, the library community, start to surface and make available. This, Vinod's point about the OPAC and the semantic web, not knowing where one begins and one ends, is exactly right. From a user experience, there is no beginning and end to the web, and there is no beginning and end to the data web. Our job is really about providing these control points that our communities can start connecting to, and through those control points, help them navigate. So a few months ago, building off this story of personal exploration, I found myself with the opportunity to head down to Culpeper. This was a wonderful, eye-opening experience, and apparently they're on this Polycom sitting next to me, so shout out to you guys. But they were very kind in letting me basically share some of my passions and problems of organizing stuff that I care about. This is an example of that. And they were very kind in sharing with the problems and passions that they are dealing with. This is a Wednesday for them, okay? Right? How do we deal with a huge amounts of different kinds of audio and visual material and provide very lightweight, flexible ways for making simple descriptions possible and over time starting to create a tapestry of more valuable, discoverable data. So I basically went back into my, let's see here. Where did that go? Oh, shoot. Let's see if this... I don't know if that's coming across at all. All right. Don't worry if it doesn't. It's not a big genre I care about either. But what's actually quite fascinating is, this is a problem that I have. Basically, the kind of information I particularly care about, and in full disclosure, I am not alone. But folks basically dealing with vinyl recordings, they care about a lot more than just the title and the tracks and things like that. For me, recording engineer is a critical asset and aspect in which I may buy or acquire different kinds of records. I love any jazz that's basically recorded by, Rudy Van Gelder. Yeah, nothing. I understand. Doesn't matter. The point is that with these profiles, I can in fact build off of BibFrame, add additional vocabularies that I care about, recording engineer, snap it to other authorities that Rudy Van Gelder is actually known for, And even though I'm basically extending the BibFrame profile for a particular purpose, mine, I can actually leverage 95% of the other BibFrame assets of making that possible and leverage these profiles for, in essence, creating my own cataloging interface to that kind of stuff. All right? So I'm looking at a different way of basically starting to connect and relate different kinds of assets that don't fit the traditional MARC record well, that don't fit the traditional RDA record well, but that actually help me tremendously in terms of organizing my assets. And I'm going to do another quick demo. Sorry. Because this is actually useful as well. Let me clear this one out. So I've loaded this as my personal account. I don't have the audio one loaded here, but let me show just briefly the other one. This is the VRA profile, if I was going to basically describe an image. One of the things, not only are we doing look-aheads to try and basically do matching, but we're also creating what I'd call data clipboards for basically drop zones. So the notion of being able to drag a person over on the author, or in this particular case, I'm basically dragging an image over on my VRA editor. I'm actually capturing the data behind this image, the source, the width, the height, the depth, file formats, all the rest of the stuff that basically comes along native with this BibFrame item. So when we want to start talking about snapping together different kinds of data, it's not just search look ahead, but we want to basically start dragging and dropping these different BibFrame data assets and start to connect those together as well. Again, very difficult in a very generalized semantic web RDF space, but if we constrain the space, as we have with BibFrame, we can start to do a tremendous amount of ways in which we as a community can formalize our cataloging rules, but we as, I would say, micro communities or individuals can start to use these same infrastructure, tools, vocabularies for describing other kinds of assets that we care about and start to connect these together in a seamless user experience that allows me to connect to other kinds of high quality content. All right, back to the talk. Now, Act 3, benefits, near-term opportunities. All right. So one of the benefits of this, in short, is to start thinking about the fact that as we start exposing these particular control points, thinking about related, what's related linked services as library commons. If I have in my personal discography a bunch of different resources, in this particular case a vinyl album, that actually shares, World War II, British Air Force, a URI for this particular subject that turns out to also have the same URI for these particular books, we are not far off from me being able to browse my discography and see related books that are from the library. In essence, delivering library content to where the user is experiencing the searching to begin with, to deliver high quality content in a way that the user cares about, wherever that user may be. It's not necessarily going to a particular website or a particular branch, but starting to expose these services where that data is more flowing freely at localized applications or community applications or global applications. And this notion of being able to take a particular object and find other kinds of object is enabled by the fact that we're creating linkages back to the same identifier. So any one of these things we pick up, we start to see the other ones in context. And libraries and linked data are the enabling foundation for making that happen. This was the attachment that basically, I think, got sent out to all of you. And I couldn't help but look at this and say, first of all, thank you for putting this all together, and apparently for sending it out to so many people. But also the fact that it may be useful to start thinking about this and these kind of things as more actionable data. Not just documents, but the data that's behind them. So this is about BibFrame, okay? If we're successful somewhere down the line, there will be a DUI code for BibFrame. There will be an LCSH entry for BibFrame. There will be different controlled identifiers for this concept that we call BibFrame. I had to put this in my calendar. So I look at this document in one screen and I type it into my calendar in the other screen, right? I look at it on this page and I try to place it on a map to get here. I know how to get here, but the cab driver sure as heck didn't, right? There are people on this that I might basically be interested in learning more about. And more specifically, there are two very important people that are at the bottom that I need to contact, which I did not, sorry. But the point is that what we're trying to do is make it as easy to create the actionable data that allows me to sort of drop this onto my contacts page or drop this onto a map, to take this document and drop it on my calendar and have it show up. This notion of a data clipboard around these BibFrame assets is a very real possibility. I'm not talking about in the future, I'm talking about in months. And I actually, by ALA, I was sort of hoping by days. It turns out in this community, how many people know this? Yes? The community information bit for MARC? Nobody? Come on. Thank you. Right. It didn't get a lot of play, but the notion of basically, as a library, starting to talk about the communities, the events that are basically coming around, that are happening near me, right? The notion of being able to start, with news syndication and syndication standards, with some very simple scaffolding from BibFrame, with the ability of creating a quick profile of this, we can quickly come up with ways in which we can capture these community events, connect them to the assets that we basically care about, and the next time that we have a book review or a book reading that includes all of these different books and authors, that comes as a bundled set of information. The next time we have a poetry reading, this connects to a whole range of related books that are nearby. If you like this particular person, you may find these other books at your library valuable. These are all part of being a set of interconnected library data. And we can start thinking about these things not as separate data sets that are disconnected, not as separate modules that your ILS vendor will sell you, but as part of a large BibFrame substrate in which my library can participate in, for assets that I have on the shelf, to services that I basically provide. I have a 3D printer, I have copying services, to upcoming readings by my favorite poet. We are not far away from any of this. What else does this give you? The fact that we are basically creating content and linking to content leaves little breadcrumbs on the web. We can track those breadcrumbs as activities and start to think about not only the content that we're publishing, but the connections that we're making among content. And from an activity browser perspective, track without any additional work what we as users are doing in terms of connecting things. So in this particular case, I'm showing an activity browser. I'm not sure how well you can see that. But this basically combines how much you're basically publishing in terms of content and how much you're linking to other content. I'm going to basically zoom in here in the center actions and basically talk back to that sort of reciprocal linking. In a linked data BibFrame environment, as a cataloger, if I basically say this new asset is a translation of this old one, I'm actually sending basically, I'm pointing at this new resource. But the first time an application traverses that, it leaves a breadcrumb of where it came back. So this particular action basically says you're cataloging resource, this fighter pilot has an incoming link. Would you like to set up a reverse one? So the fact that we can, by linking to these assets, make it extremely easy to update the old ones by one click allows us to continue that kind of link integrity that we have in our brains when we type it in or wish we had time for, but don't. So there's a tremendous amount of not automation, but machine-facilitated capabilities that we, the human, can then act on to make sure that our links are, that we're connected. And this is a very powerful meme. This is not new. This is very common in the blog sphere. This is very common in various different communities, but it's not yet prevalent in the data community. And I think has immense application when we think about taking other kinds of web practices, but applied to our particular collaborative, curating, data connecting, cataloging side of our industry. Further, how we start connecting things together and the vocabularies we start using on this, and how we use BibFrame and how we use other vocabularies, these all become data assets, all linked. We can run the same kind of, if folks are familiar with Google Analytics over documents, we can run the same kind of data analytics over this linked data. We can start to look at this data in a much more actionable, much more quantitative way. We can start to understand where confusion lies in terms of use, where commonality is in place. This is incredibly important for us in the BibFrame in particular, as over the next year we start looking at how this version 1 vocabulary, Sally puts, version 1, is being used. What patterns are we seeing that are common? What areas do we need to focus in on? Where are we seeing it used in new and interesting ways? There's a lot of benefits simply by taking advantage of the web as an architecture. And that's a very exciting aspect of this. We talk a lot about the benefits to the linked data community and the benefits to the user community, but the benefits of the cataloging community in terms of getting a better understanding of how our data is being used, how much we're connecting, how efficient we're being, what other kinds of data we might need to connect to, all become sort of a very interesting play here. And again, this isn't very difficult to do in the semantic web, but by constraining this, we've been able to really accelerate the development activities for making this happen. What you're looking at from a software development standpoint is a 2-month sprint to basically get this infrastructure in place. Our target is to basically have this prototype in place by ALA. Now this is based on years and years and years of open source development around these open standards, but the fact that we're building off of these open standards allows us to accelerate these kind of ideas very quickly in terms of tools that hopefully will be of use to us going forward. So BibFrame, a common model that we talked about in terms of connecting different communities, but Profiles provides a mean for us to sort of constrain the different aspects of BibFrame that we're interested in and project our local meaning into a common framework based on these global standards. I don't need the entire vocabulary to describe my record collection. I don't need the entire vocabulary to describe my, family history. I don't need the entire, record collection to basically describe the books that I have on my shelf. But if I can use these different parts of the vocabulary in a common infrastructure, I have a very personal database that I care about, enabled by the library community. If I can start sharing that with others, sharing that with my community, this is a really exciting time for libraries. Profiles allow me to do this in terms of just the subset that I need. The kinds of tools that you see in the BibFrame editor are one example of how those profiles are used. Part of what we were trying to do is provide a means for allowing us as a community to start experimenting more with the vocabulary. We don't need to wait for a full stable vocabulary in order to get a lot of things done. We've got enough stability now with the general tools like this we can start basically exploring. Further, we wanted to basically make clear that the information model that's behind the scene is not the information model that's projected to the user. You'll notice in these cataloging experiences, there's no notion of work and instance mentioned. RDF is a very powerful bit of data infrastructure on the web. HTTP is a very powerful bit of data infrastructure on the web. It's protocol infrastructure. URIs are a very powerful decentralized identification mechanism on the web. Users should know nothing about these things, right? These are hidden from the users. These are about infrastructure that makes the work that we do possible. But we wanted to basically provide some tools that allow, in very practical ways, the ability of constraining BibFrame into just the spaces that make sense, and from a cataloging perspective, tools that allowed us to get our jobs done, but not worry so much about the model. That gets handled behind the scenes. Thank you. And we have exactly as much time for or do we have time for talks? Or? Yes. Okay, all right. All right. I'm not sure. This seems like a shouting group. No? But yes.
Can you show us where we can find more information that you indirectly referred to as on your clipboard? Like where can we find under the hood information on the compatibility of the, for example, geospatial data, the standards and taxonomies?
You know, that's a great question. There is no information about this. You literally are looking at a sprint. But I will,
So in the future, where would we look for it? Is it going to be on your company website?
No, so to be very clear, I expect the majority of the information that you'll find on profiles and examples of this, you know, this will be on bibframe.org. So from the standpoint, you know, this isn't a product we're going to sell you. This is an enabling bit of infrastructure that we, the community, can basically, you know, start to get a better understanding of the value proposition BibFrame has to offer. So bibframe.org, you know, watch that space. Yes?
Assuming libraries need to know license or rights information
Mm-hmm.
from the Copyright Office in order to have their machines know whether they can or how they can deliver content to their users, how have you started to talk about the rights or license information that organizations will need and how it fits into the model in order to, with authority at the local level, decide whether and how to deliver the content?
That's a great question. I mean, I spent a lot of time in sort of what we describe as policy-aware infrastructure. License, rights, access control is an important part of that. The short answer is this isn't specific to BibFrame. This is a larger web issue. And again, by the standpoint of grafting BibFrame into, you know, a set of these larger open web standards, we can take advantage of some of these things. So first and foremost, the fact that we can start giving these things identifiers and start connecting them together is a very useful thing from a cataloging standpoint. It also becomes incredibly, I don't want to say incredibly, but it becomes easier to manage some of the complexities of rights now that we have different things that are identified. In short, the best approaches that I've seen haven't been, in terms of the web in general, haven't been the fact that, you know, from a policy perspective, this particular thing is access or not, but it's almost a risk exposure in terms of, you know, what things have been stated and what things haven't. But to your particular point, it's very easy to attach actionable rights to any one of the objects that you basically choose to catalog. The policy enforcement layer of this is something that is a trickier thing in general to take on. But I would urge us not to think about that aspect again as a BibFrame or a library specific problem, but rather sort of the web problem in general. And there are actually a lot of different groups that are actively sort of exploring this that, you know, if you're not aware of, I'm happy to sort of point you to. In fact, I would like to see more active engagement from the library community in those discussions. They are primarily dominated by commercial, you know, interests. And the library community is not as active as it perhaps could be in those discussions.
Extension 6783.
Somebody get me a pen. No, that's so, I mean, this is a question for any, I mean, we've got a little bit of time, but just to be clear. Yeah, absolutely.
On the rights management thing, ultimately, the rights have to be contained in the object. Of course, there are billions of objects. So how do you do that? you have to start putting objects into classes. You have to start putting people or people that access these things into classes, and then get general policies for these classes, and then it comes down to the object. Once you have the object and you can identify who wants it, where you're getting, then you can actually decide if you're going to give it or not. But you can't come in with large groups and say this group does this unless you put the objects in those groups. Yeah.
So just to dovetail on that, I mean, one of the aspects that is very important is the fact that we're taking that first step. You know, by putting these things into groups, by putting those relationships in place, we at least have a better sense of how to manage that problem. But it's a very complicated problem. And right now, with various different business interests and requirements, you know, the future of that's, yeah, exactly. Yes. I'm sorry, there's a bright light right in your, yeah.
Can't help that. There is something called the MARC format for classification. In it, you will find two different views, DUIs and LCs of hierarchies of concepts. I'm not talking about the notation scheme, which is something cryptic for spines and links between bib records and the authority, the classification record. This data is made available from LC and OCLC to classifiers, but the reader never gets a clue.
Right.
And could they, under the bib framework here?
Certainly. I mean, I'm going to let Sally or others jump in on some of the nuances of the classification, but one of the things that's happening, you know, with some of the work of starting to basically expose some of these classification schemes as web addresses. You know, Dewey.info is an example of some of the Dewey classification, you know, that now is an actionable web resource. The ability of starting to think about classification not just, you know, perhaps in the United States as a shelving construct, or as Europe as a subject construct, but as a web resource, allows us to do that same kind of pivoting and same kind of access that we were talking about subjects as well. Show me other things that have this kind of classification. We do a tremendous amount of work, you know, from a library cataloging perspective to organize this content, but the actionable data to the end users of this is very small. With a very small amount of additional work, or my hope is with tools that we're showing even less work, we can make that kind of classification, you know, aspect far more actionable and far more, you know, useful to the end user. Still useful to us, but the goal is basically also making it far more useful to the end user.
For all I know, museums and archives have their own classification.
I can assure you they do. And
maybe they should be in there too. I don't know. But
yeah.
They're typically concerned with a one-time item of some sort, whereas libraries share classification and thereby benefit anybody who has another copy of the same item.
That's right. I mean, it's important to understand there are different community requirements or business requirements that come along with this. So I brought Dewey up as an example, but I'll bring the World Health Organization up as another example. The ICD, International Classification of Disease, is another kind of classification scheme. You know, this isn't really used for doctors necessarily to share patients with other doctors, but it is used in terms of identifying patterns of, you know, outbreaks or patterns of ailments or patterns of health that might happen in a particular hospital or region or you know, country. So, in fact, there are different purposes that these different classifications serve, but what you're seeing is a common infrastructure in which they're starting to be exposed. The same kind of web resources you're seeing for Dewey, you're starting to see for ICD. The same kinds of frameworks that you're seeing for describing, you know, our particular bibliographic assets. You know, if you go into a hospital, they have things called medical coders, which are basically catalogers. And they assign, based on these doctors' descriptions, ICD codes. Why is that important to us? Well, in fact, it's actually incredibly important to where's NLM, NIH. Many of us that are basically bridging the public health library space. So what's useful here is, one, moving together as a community in the library space, but two, doing it in a very conscious effort with other communities that are moving together in terms of a shared infrastructure, and then building off of that kind of cooperative and sharing in a way we could have never done, 40 years ago. And that's a very exciting time. Being able to basically identify patterns of, within a hospital, for example, of a certain kind of ailment, and quickly accessing journal articles that basically might help me understand what's going on, is joining two different worlds together. And this is a mechanism for making that kind of joining very actionable and making those kind of classifications, far more useful to the end users, in this particular case, the doctors, but patients as well. It's a great question, yeah. There is not, in all languages. I guess I should have made this point. A lot of the work that we're doing, so BibFrame, building off of a lot of these, web technologies. These web technologies, World Wide Web, the first operative word there is world. Gosh, I had to say that a couple times. Internationalization, accessibility, these are key aspects in terms of a lot of the standards and technologies that underpin the web. So building off of these technologies allow us, to basically take advantage of a lot of that hard work in the internationalization community, in the accessibility community, without, standing on the shoulders of giants. But
Say something here.
Maybe all of you should come up, I don't know.
Traditionally, libraries have been in the business of removing barriers. Spatial barriers, bringing stuff from various points, financial barriers, as you know, and temporal barriers, things coming from 50, 200 years ago. Now there's a fourth barrier that people like Eric and I and others are working on, and that is the intellectual barrier to information. The intellectual barrier to information comes in different forms. The easiest form is language. Do I need to know Greek in order to look at Greek costumes? How can we classify that material so I don't know Greek, I don't have to know Greek to get that information? There are other kinds of intellectual barriers, no matter what subject matter you know in terms of classification. There are other subject matters you know nothing about. And therefore, how do you access information that is classified by the medical groups, and I'm not a doctor or a pharmacist or whatever else, and get access to that information? And that's that intellectual barrier gap that we're talking about, that we need to somehow bridge as we go through these tools that are interconnected to each other. So I don't necessarily have to know the vocabulary of that domain or the classification of that domain to access information in that domain. So intellectual barriers would be the fourth barrier for libraries.
Regina, yeah.
So we also have a big barrier these days in a resource barrier. Not enough people to do all the work. And I'm wondering if some of the tools that are, I know only in prototype form right now, but are anticipated, might allow us to work more in batch modes. I keep wondering that we tend to do everything one book at a time, but we get the books 1,000 at a time. And I'm just wondering if there's any thought being given to, okay, I've got a box of books, but they're all by the same publisher, all published in the same place. What can I do to set up something in a more batch mode?
I can try that, but by all means.
Essentially, again, looking at the general principle of things, there are certain concepts that are brought to mind. One of the concepts is source point data capture. Nowadays, everybody, point of sale transactions coming through immigration yesterday, they make you fill out the immigration form yourself on the computer. So essentially, everybody's trying to capture data at the source. You have to ask yourself, how can libraries capture data at the source? So you put the burden on people like publishers. Cataloging in print, I guess, was a concept that came many years ago. So you have to go back to the person who creates the data to help classify it under controlled systems like the one Eric is showing you. So you have certain things that are mandatory, certain things that are optional, but they have to do it. If they don't have to do it, then you have to get organizations like OCLC to cooperatively do it, so one person does it and everybody else copies it. So those are the only two ways to get it, but nothing beats getting it at the source. The other concept is destination point printing. Now, Eric mentioned in his talk, I don't know if you caught that or not, do you have a 3D printer? And 3D printers will come. But the idea there of 3D printing is exactly that, destination point printing, whatever it is. In this case, in 3D printing, you're producing automobile parts or rings or whatever you're producing. But you're designing it in some place, and you're shipping that document somewhere else, and it's printed at some destination, which is very, very useful for submarines and other places that need parts all the time. So if you look at anything you do from a workflow point of view, and you ask yourself these two questions, source point capture, destination point printing, then you come to the answer, pretty close to the answer, what you need to do, and how you put your workflow in to make that happen. That's a generic answer to the question you're asking. Yes, ma'am.
Can I follow on the capture data at the source? You said you talked to publishers. I'm curious to hear what they told you. I mean, ideally, libraries would like to get standard work numbers, name identifiers, metadata in a format we understand, and uniform titles, the whole shebang. Where is the carrot for them to provide that? And what did they say to you? What do they need out of all of this?
It's difficult to answer that question because they see the world from a different point of view than we or librarians see the world.
What do they want?
So there has to be some incentive for them to do what we expect to do. The incentive is that if you catalog a book, it's going to cost you somewhere between $2 and $40, depending on what you're doing with it. If you're doing copy cataloging, it's closer to $2. If you're doing original cataloging, it's closer to $40. What we have to do is come back to the publishers. Like in Canada, they passed a regulation saying that anybody that sells ebooks will provide metadata for service providers, or we will not buy. That is something Canadians can do, but Americans can't, because our society works in different ways. So you can impose certain things, or you can create an incentive for them to do it. You go back to the publisher and say, you want $28 for the book? I'll give you $30, but you have to provide me this information. And suddenly the publisher says, you mean I get $2 extra for every book I sell? The economics become in their favor. And we have to think in those broad terms to make that happen. Otherwise, we'll continue to do what we're doing, which is so wasteful. And you don't need to be told that.
Can I offer a less politic response? I mean, that was, the incentives that publishers are seeing at a certain level. I mean, not general publishers. I mean, the money is an issue here, and the inefficiencies of the library community are actually something that benefit that financial side of this. I do think that what was mentioned is actually in a creative attempt to do this, but I actually think that we also should be looking at tighter cooperation with things like open access and open journals, the kind of things that we actually want, that kind of more machine processable data coming from that point source. Because I think if we can have far more data portability between other ways folks are publishing than the traditional business models that are in a very difficult position. I mean, their margins are different, and some are extremely high, some are extremely low. I don't know if the solution is going to come from the publishers. It's got to come from us. And I think part of the way of it comes from us is to working with other streams of information of how people are publishing to make sure that that workflow between more friendly conduits and ourselves is in place. I think that kind of edge will affect the business side in a way that will cause change.
Question?
Are you considering in the future building even more onto the reification that you talked about earlier? And by that I mean it sounds like with just perhaps a tad more development of that, you'd actually completely resolve the biggest issue with semantic data linking, such as priorities. Like, you're already working on the relationships. The second step to fix that whole huge issue would be, well, okay, the relevance of those priorities, the closeness, the levels of that relationship, to the point where a huge Fortune 500 would want to buy you out.
That's not necessarily the objective. But the thing is, what we're trying to do is create the links. The philosophy has been go as far as you can see, because you'll be able to see farther when you get there. And that's the development strategy that we've been following. We understand a certain domain, we go up there and then see what happened and what we learned. Now that will be a very important thing, I know, but we haven't yet got any market for BibFrame, and we're already spending lots of money on it. So we need to make it economically viable as we go, because we have to pay for every cup of coffee we drink.
Right, but that would be so valuable that that would generate interest even more in possibility.
Point well taken, I don't disagree with you.
I'm a cataloger, and the music cataloger to be more specific. Watching the presentation, I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, so take it how you will. Watching the presentation, I was feeling some of the same vertigo I felt about 25 years ago when probably in the same room I was hearing about something called the internet. One of the reasons for that vertigo has to do with what I see to be a fundamental kind of almost contradiction in your entire presentation here, and that is this intense desire for universal access to absolutely everything, i.e. Represented maybe by that sort of dandelion puff of the web, of the links to everything you were showing, versus what you kept calling the need to constrain all of this for certain communities, okay? There's a disconnect between those two visions that I really didn't see resolved in any way here. And from the standpoint of cataloging, for instance, I can't tell you the complications involved in a person, a cataloger, an actual human being, trying to negotiate these connections in a real world kind of way, especially in an institution like this where authority is everything. And so the minute a link is attempted, well, that link has to be verified in some way. And the way, at least we're used to verifying it, is by an intellectual endeavor. Okay? So, basically what I'm saying is there's this huge contradiction that I haven't seen resolved, and I can't quite imagine how that is going to be resolved within the context of productive cataloging mode.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Question.
I mean, I don't think of it as a disconnect. I think of it as but I do think of it, and I deal with it on a daily basis, a very difficult creative tension. I want to sort of answer this at least partially, but you're hitting on some very real points, and ones that we're trying to basically advance the discussion of, not propose a final solution towards. So, underpinning a tremendous, these particular standards are these little RDF blocks that I was mentioning. So the fact that different communities might be constraining, the constraints that I'm referring to at a certain level are about really sort of defining the subsets of vocabularies that they particularly care about. When you catalog a book, or when you catalog a cartographic material, you're using, in essence, different parts of MARC to describe those different artifacts. That's at a certain level what I mean by constraining. I'm choosing a set of properties to deal with certain kinds of artifacts. And this is a tool that allows me to sort of narrow that down and hide a lot of that complexity to sort of get to the salient bits. The links that you're seeing there in terms of the type ahead and sort of connecting, in essence are to authoritative information. So connecting to a VIAF authority, for example, by typing ahead, I can, instead of going and searching, I'm literally doing the search behind the scene and snapping that information together. Now, the challenge is, of course, name disambiguation, which one of these things am I going to be dealing with? I mean, this is where the human very much is basically, has to be in the loop. While these technologies get used by very sort of machine processing aspects and interesting projects, they don't really basically hold a candle to what the human does and the decision making that we do. So this is really a way of just accelerating at a certain level that human process, not replacing it in any sort of way. And finally, one of the things that's important that's again hidden behind the scene that I will strive to make a little bit clearer is the person that's logging in essence, basically is making assertions about this point. I actually don't choose to use the word reification. It's a word that we used early on in the RDF specifications, and this is the only room I think I've heard that word uttered where most people don't go, but in essence, the provenance of that assertion is a very important point to track. So who's making these assertions and the justification for these assertions is actually an important one to capture as well. So what you're seeing is a tremendous amount of that aspect hidden from the end user in terms of doing that. Not to say one person is right or wrong, but really as a way of in the future getting a sense of which kinds of things one might trust and what they can't. The concern I have about BibFrame or linked data or the semantic web in general, I'm very excited to see the direction in which we as a community are taking this. But very quickly in a connected set of data, it won't be the fact just enough that there's something that explains the justification. The reality is you'll have conflicting statements. You'll have one person basically saying, this particular event is responsible by this particular party, and this particular event's responsible by this other particular party. Who you trust in conflicting statements becomes an important part of this. So the authoritative nature of you, the cataloger, I'm going to trust you. I don't even know who your name is, but I'm going to trust you a lot more than I'm going to trust myself for sort of snapping these things together. And that, I think, again, is a very important part of how we, libraries, basically form the semantic web. We have the trust in the physical space, and I believe that trust is transferred here in the electronic space. If we see conflicting results, I'm going to go with a librarian every single time in the semantic web. And these are just tools that basically allow that fact that you are a cataloger from the Library of Congress to be asserted in a global way so that I would differentiate your kinds of authoritative connections from my kinds of authoritative connections.
Yeah, and one thing here. I'll give you a practical example of how these tools help the work you do. Several years ago, we were doing a catalog for all of Poland, and they were cataloging everything in Polish subject headings and in English. That's what they required. Now, I just came back from Switzerland last night. The National Library there is doing a multilingual subject heading thing where the starting premise is that we will catalog each book for subjects either in Italian or in German or in French. And you, meaning us, will build the tools so that when the user searches in one language, he or she gets the results in all languages. And that's doable, very doable. So you don't have to now catalog in all languages as long as you have thesauri that can be linked and work with sitting somewhere that you do that. And that's happening now, cutting down on the time that people have to put doing the intellectual work that machines can do faster and better. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, I firstly want to say that as a cataloger, I'm very fascinated about this new data. And the first time I see the whole because we behind the scene coding years after years. Actually, these days with RDA also driving me crazy. Still trapped in the MARC structure, still coding actually text strings rather than like user-friendly, usable metadata. Actually, these days, no user go to catalog first. They just go to Google first or Wikipedia. And when this will give us a hope that one day our data may be clickable and then directly linked to Wikipedia that the librarian think reliable and then choose the user to. So that's the future that I'm looking forward to, and I'm very excited to be part of that. I don't want to be trapped again in the like a box, just a card catalog. No question here.
No question.
Thank you very much. It's an excellent comment to end the session on. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.